Justice rarely arrives with warning. It does not knock politely or send word ahead. It does not ask whether people are ready to face it. It simply shifts the ground beneath everyone at once, turning certainty into fragility and power into exposure. And in the hours after the violence in the courtroom, that shift began to gather force, subtle at first, like pressure building deep underground where no one can see the fault lines tightening, where decisions made in quiet offices start to connect, where rules that once seemed distant and procedural sharpen into instruments capable of cutting through influence, reputation, and carefully built illusions. The CEO had always believed in momentum, in the idea that speed and confidence could carry him through any crisis, that a strong legal team and a louder narrative could drown out inconvenient truths, and for years that belief had served him well in boardrooms where deals closed over polished tables and disagreements dissolved under strategic smiles. But the courtroom was different terrain, governed not by charisma, but by record, not by persuasion alone, but by evidence. And as the afternoon deepened, he began to sense that the familiar tools he relied on were slipping from his grasp. Not dramatically, not in a single blow, but in a series of quiet, accumulating constraints that narrowed his space to maneuver. Orders were issued with calm authority, procedural yet unyielding, setting boundaries that could not be crossed without consequence, and each one felt, to him, like a door closing softly but firmly, limiting access, restricting movement, reshaping the landscape he had assumed he could navigate freely, while across the building clerks processed filings with the steady rhythm of people who understood that justice is often built from paperwork as much as from speeches, that the true turning points in a case often hide in the fine print where rights are defined and protections take form. For her, the shift felt different, less like doors closing and more like space slowly, cautiously opening, though she did not yet trust it, did not yet believe the ground beneath her could hold. Because betrayal teaches you to expect collapse, to assume that support is temporary and safety conditional. Yet as medical reports were documented, as statements were recorded, as formal recognition of what had occurred moved from shock to official record, she felt the faintest change in the air around her, like a room where windows have been cracked open after being sealed too long. The air still heavy but no longer suffocating. Outside, the story spread with the speed of outrage, but inside the system a quieter narrative advanced, one shaped not by headlines but by statutes, by codes designed for moments exactly like this, and people who had remained distant observers began to step into defined roles, each action small on its own, yet together forming a structure that altered the balance between them. Because sudden reversals rarely come from a single dramatic gesture. They emerge when many precise pieces align at once, when timing, evidence, and authority converge. His legal team worked urgently, voices low and tense, recalibrating strategy, aware now that the incident had shifted the frame of the case entirely, that what might once have been argued as a private marital dispute had entered the realm of documented public misconduct, that the court's perception, once focused on assets and agreements, now included safety, behavior, and character, and that change in focus carried implications far beyond a single hearing, touching custody, credibility, and the court's tolerance for risk. He felt it in the way people looked at him, no longer with curiosity or even scandalized fascination, but with a measured distance, as though an invisible line had been drawn around him, marking a boundary between who he had appeared to be and what he had revealed, and though pride urged him to push back, to assert control, the environment no longer responded the way he expected, because authority in that building did not bend to volume, and every attempt to dominate the moment only reinforced the record forming quietly against him. Meanwhile, she moved through evaluations and conversations with a kind of exhausted focus, answering questions, signing forms, absorbing information that would once have overwhelmed her. Yet something in her had shifted too, a subtle straightening of the spine, not from confidence in the future, but from the realization that the worst humiliation had already been endured in public view, that fear of exposure had lost its power now that everything was visible, and that strange clarity gave her a steadier footing than she had known in months. In a small office lined with shelves, decisions were reviewed again, not impulsively but with the care required when lives are affected, and each confirmation reinforced the direction events were taking, the framework tightening around behavior that could no longer be minimized, while in the hallway outside, footsteps echoed in patterns that felt almost rhythmic, like the pulse of a machine long in motion, indifferent to individual panic, built to move forward once set in motion. The reversal did not announce itself with cheers or dramatic declarations. It unfolded through tone, through posture, through the subtle redistribution of certainty, and those attuned to such shifts could see it in the way proceedings resumed, in the order of priorities, in the emphasis placed on protection and accountability, in the absence of deference that wealth often commands elsewhere, replaced here by a neutrality that, paradoxically, stripped him of the advantage he had always relied upon. For the first time since the scandal broke, he confronted the possibility that control had passed beyond his reach, not because someone had taken it in anger, but because the system, once activated by clear violation, moved according to its own logic, one that did not weigh social standing against documented harm. And that realization unsettled him more deeply than any accusation, because it revealed a domain where his influence thinned, where outcomes depended less on strategy and more on facts already fixed in time. She sensed none of the procedural complexity, only the shift in how she was addressed, the careful explanations, the emphasis on her rights, the repeated assurance that her safety mattered in this space. And though part of her remained braced for disappointment, another part began cautiously to absorb the possibility that the narrative she had lived under, where his power defined the boundaries of her world, was no longer absolute, that other forces, quieter but firmer, had entered the equation. In the courtroom again, the air carried a different weight, less chaotic, more deliberate, as though the earlier violence had burned away pretense, leaving only essentials, and each exchange now occurred within a tighter framework, the room itself seeming to lean toward order after the rupture, and in that order lay the foundation of reversal. Because once behavior is named and recorded, it cannot easily be reframed as misunderstanding. He sat straighter, speaking less, aware that every word now landed on a record shaped by what had already happened, while across from him she remained composed in a fragile, deliberate way, her hand often resting over her stomach, a quiet anchor that seemed to remind everyone present that the stakes extended beyond reputation or finance into something far more human and immediate. Time stretched, yet with each procedural step the path ahead grew more defined, branching less, narrowing toward outcomes that had once seemed distant, and though no one declared victory or defeat, the direction of movement became clearer to those watching closely. The current no longer swirling but flowing steadily one way, guided by rules that had waited patiently for their moment to apply. Outside, commentary speculated about drama and emotion, but inside the transformation was technical, almost clinical. A reclassification of the situation that altered how every subsequent decision would be weighed, and that shift, quiet and precise, carried more impact than any outburst could because it embedded the event into the structure of the case itself, making it part of the foundation rather than a passing incident. She felt tired beyond words, yet beneath the exhaustion a thin thread of steadiness held, a sense that the ground was no longer dissolving under her feet, that even if the future remained uncertain, the present moment was being taken seriously in a way she had not experienced before, and that recognition, small as it was, began to replace panic with endurance. He watched the process unfold with growing stillness, the fight draining not from surrender, but from the dawning understanding that the arena had changed, that this was no longer a contest of narratives, but a progression of consequences, and that realization settled over him like weight, heavy, inescapable, pressing down on every assumption he had carried into that room. Around them, professionals continued their roles, voices measured, movements efficient, the machinery of justice turning with neither haste nor delay. And in that steady motion lay the true drama, the quiet, irreversible shift from spectacle to accountability, from chaos to structure, from dominance to exposure, the reversal not loud but profound, altering trajectories in ways that would continue long after the day's session closed. The effects radiating outward through decisions yet to be made, through protections yet to be enforced, through a future already bending under the weight of what had been set into motion. The change no longer a possibility but a process unfolding in real time, step by step, document by document, breath by breath, carrying them all forward into a landscape reshaped by a single moment that had stripped illusion away and left only consequence in its place. The air in the room steady, the path ahead narrowing, the balance irrevocably shifted as the system moved onward, unpausing, unyielding, into the next phase of what would follow, the reversal deepening with every passing minute as certainty drained from one side and gathered, slowly, cautiously, on the other, the transformation still in motion, still building, still pressing forward without pause or signal of slowing as the long arc of justice continued its turn, drawing the future closer, tightening the circle, carrying everything with it into the widening reach of outcomes not yet spoken but already taking shape beneath the surface, advancing quietly, steadily, into the space ahead where the story would keep unfolding, consequence upon consequence, shift upon shift, the reversal no longer sudden but sustained, moving onward through the measured cadence of law, through the silent accumulation of decisions, through the steady breathing of those caught within it. the air thick with inevitability as the moment stretched forward, unresolved, still becoming, still moving. Still turning toward what waited just beyond the edge of what any of them could yet see, the process continuing, the balance changing, the path narrowing further as everything leaned into the next second, and the next, and the next, without pause, without relief, without any sign of turning back as the unfolding carried on into the widening space of what remained to come. Still in motion, still gathering, still pressing forward, the reversal deep and ongoing, the air charged with the weight of it as the machinery of justice rolled ahead, unbroken, unhesitating, into the long stretch of consequences that lay waiting, the transformation incomplete yet unstoppable, the moment suspended in its own forward motion, still advancing, still reshaping, still moving into the space ahead where everything would continue to shift, to tighten, to unfold, the current steady, the direction set, the story pushing onward through the narrowing channel of what had already begun and would not easily be undone as the hours continued their slow passage and the quiet force of reversal held firm, carrying all of them deeper into the unfolding, into the tightening arc, into the relentless forward movement of justice in motion, still turning, still pressing, still advancing into the vast unfinished space ahead where the consequences waited, drawing closer with every breath, every step, every measured word as the process continued, unbroken, into the next moment, and the next, and the next. Justice does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it arrives as a quiet rearranging of weight in a room, a subtle but undeniable shift in who holds certainty and who does not. And in the days following the courtroom incident, that shift began to ripple outward from a truth no one had anticipated, a connection hidden in plain sight that transformed the emotional geometry of everything that followed. Because authority is one thing when it is abstract, distant, faceless, but it becomes something far more complex when it is tied to history, to shared childhood air, to memories formed long before titles and robes and formal language created distance between people. The judge had built his life on restraint, on the discipline of separating personal feeling from public duty because climbing into a position of legal authority required the careful pruning of impulse, the training of expression, the steady development of a mind that could hold pain and still weigh evidence with clarity, and over the years that discipline had become second nature, a structure inside him as solid as the courtroom walls. Yet structures built by effort can still tremble when the past walks through the door wearing the face of someone you once knew by heart. He had not expected to see her name on the docket, not expected the collision of his professional role with the fragile, stubborn little girl he once shielded from neighborhood storms. The sister who shared secrets whispered after lights out, who believed in him long before anyone else did, and when recognition first struck, it did not arrive with emotion, but with stillness, a deep internal pause where memory and present collided, and he had to choose, in an instant, which part of himself would lead. Recusal would have been the obvious escape, the cleanest way to avoid conflict, yet the situation was already in motion, already witnessed, already marked by the violence that had erupted before him, and stepping aside might delay protection, might place her before someone less attuned to the nuances of what had occurred, less anchored to the urgency beneath the formal language, and so he chose the harder path, the one requiring absolute control, where he would remain but become even more vigilant with himself, checking every instinct, ensuring that fairness was not only practiced but visible. Hidden family ties do not erase the law, they complicate the emotional terrain through which the law must move, and he understood that his responsibility now doubled, because any perception of bias could weaken the legitimacy of outcomes meant to protect, and legitimacy in justice is as vital as intent. So he anchored himself to procedure with almost surgical precision, letting statutes guide him like rails, even as memories pressed quietly at the edges of his focus. She did not know at first, sitting there with her cheek still marked, with the shock of public humiliation still fresh, believing herself alone in a system that felt vast and impersonal, and there was something almost sacred in that ignorance, because it allowed the process to unfold on its own terms, allowed protections to be granted not as favors but as rights, allowed her dignity to stand independent of personal connection, and he guarded that boundary carefully, understanding that revealing the bond too soon could tangle emotion into a space that required clarity. Still, the connection existed, pulsing beneath the surface like an underground current shaping the landscape above without ever being seen. And in small, nearly invisible ways it influenced the texture of attention. The extra seconds spent reviewing a detail, the refusal to let any procedural step be rushed or glossed over, the quiet insistence that documentation be thorough, that language be precise, not because she was his sister, but because he knew intimately what it meant for her not to be protected, had seen too closely in childhood how easily vulnerable people are overlooked when systems move too fast. In the courtroom, he spoke with the same measured cadence he used in every case, yet beneath that tone lay a steadiness deeper than routine, a personal understanding of stakes that extended beyond abstract principle into lived reality. And though no one else could see the memories layered beneath his gaze, they shaped his resolve not to overreach but to hold firm, to ensure that the boundaries of law were neither stretched nor weakened by emotion, but applied fully, without hesitation. For the CEO, the judge was simply another official, another obstacle to navigate, unaware that the distance he assumed was not emptiness but history held in disciplined silence. And that unawareness formed a strange imbalance of its own because he misread neutrality as detachment, not recognizing the depth of understanding behind the calm expression across from him, the life experience that made intimidation ineffective, the empathy that sharpened rather than softened commitment to the rules. The mistress, too, saw only authority in formal shape, not the human story beneath it, not the years of shared struggle that had forged a protective instinct now restrained by oath and role. And in that ignorance lay the irony of the situation. The people who had treated the wife as disposable were now subject to a system partly guided by someone who knew her value long before they ever entered her life. When the truth of the connection eventually surfaced, not through drama, but through necessity, through procedural transparency that required disclosure, the atmosphere shifted again, not toward spectacle but toward a deeper understanding of the emotional landscape already in play. And though some questioned whether he could remain, review boards and protocols weighed the circumstances carefully, examining his conduct, his rulings, the visible fairness of his approach, and found no deviation, no evidence that his decision strayed from legal standards. That confirmation did not erase tension, it reframed it, placing the hidden bond in context as a burden carried responsibly rather than a lever pulled for advantage. And for her, learning the truth arrived like light through a crack in a door, unexpected, almost disorienting, the realization that the distant authority guiding her case was the same boy who once walked her home from school, who once gave up his share of dessert so she could have more, and the knowledge stirred emotions she had kept tightly contained, not of relief alone, but of awe at how far life had carried them both. Yet even then, boundaries remained, conversations limited, interactions filtered through formal channels because their shared past could not be allowed to rewrite the present process. And so they moved through the unfolding case like two parallel lines, close yet disciplined, connected yet separate in role, each carrying the weight of the bond differently. She with a quiet comfort that she was not as alone as she thought. He with a renewed determination that his care must show itself only through fairness, never through favoritism. The hidden family tie did not tilt the scales unjustly. It stabilized them against external pressure, against attempts to manipulate narrative or delay consequence, because he understood the tactics often used in such cases, had seen powerful people exploit loopholes, and that knowledge, sharpened by personal memory of vulnerability, made him especially alert, unwilling to let process be derailed by theatrics or influence. Colleagues observed his conduct closely, perhaps expecting signs of conflict, yet what they saw instead was meticulous adherence to procedure, rulings grounded in precedent, a visible effort to remain transparent, and in that transparency lay the proof that integrity can hold even under emotional strain, that personal connection need not corrupt authority when discipline is strong. For her, the shift in balance was not about advantage but about visibility, about feeling that her experience was being heard without dismissal, that the system recognized harm without minimizing it, and knowing her brother stood within that system did not make her feel favored, only steadier, as though an unseen hand rested lightly at her back, not pushing outcomes but reminding her to stand. The CEO, confronted with this revelation, reacted with suspicion, searching for angles to challenge legitimacy. Yet every review returned the same conclusion. Procedure had been followed, rights respected, no irregularities found, and that realization tightened the circle around him because the narrative of unfair targeting dissolved under scrutiny, leaving only the record of his own actions. Justice in this form was not dramatic or loud, it was patient, structured, grounded in layers of accountability that extended beyond any one person's intent, and the hidden connection, rather than distorting that structure, illuminated it, showing how personal history can deepen commitment to fairness rather than undermine it. As hearings continued, the air in the courtroom carried the quiet awareness that more than law was present, that human stories moved beneath the surface of statutes. Yet those stories did not override rules, they gave them weight, reminding everyone that legal language ultimately exists to protect real lives, real bodies, real futures, and that recognition lent gravity to each word spoken, each order issued. Their shared past remained mostly unspoken, a silent thread woven through the formal fabric of proceedings, strengthening resolve without altering direction. And in that restraint lay a different kind of love, one expressed not through intervention but through trust in process, through faith that doing things correctly would protect her more securely than any shortcut could. The balance of justice shifted not because of favoritism but because truth had entered the record and remained there, supported by a system guided by someone who understood both its power and its limits, someone who carried memory as responsibility rather than weapon. And as the case moved forward, that balance held, steady, deliberate, shaped by law and by the quiet endurance of a bond that had survived years of distance, now present not as a dramatic reveal but as a steady undercurrent reinforcing the path ahead, the process ongoing, the outcome still forming, the connection still held carefully beneath the surface. As everything continued to unfold through rooms and rulings and measured exchanges, the weight of it all pressing forward into the days to come, the air thick with consequence, with history, with responsibility carried silently, the motion unpaused, the story still advancing, the balance still adjusting, the hidden tie still present like a pulse beneath the formal rhythm of justice in motion, guiding nothing beyond what fairness allowed, yet strengthening the resolve that fairness would not falter as the hours stretched onward, and the long arc of the case continued its steady turn into the widening space of what remained to be decided, the connection neither spotlight nor shadow but foundation, quiet, enduring, woven into the unfolding without spectacle as everything leaned into the next moment, and the next, still moving, still becoming, still pressing forward into the vast unfinished stretch ahead where law and memory walked side by side in disciplined silence, carrying the weight together without ever letting it tip the scales beyond where they were meant to rest, the process continuing, the air charged, the path narrowing, the story unresolved and still in motion as the machinery of justice rolled on, steady, unbroken, into whatever would come next, easily be undone as the hours continued their slow passage and the quiet force of reversal held firm, carrying all of them deeper into the unfolding, into the tightening arc, into the relentless forward movement of justice in motion, still turning, still pressing, still advancing into the vast unfinished space ahead where the consequences waited, drawing closer with every breath, every step, every measured word as the process continued, unbroken, into the next moment and the next and the next.